Thank you, Elliot. Welcome everyone to today's webinar, Assess, Align, Execute, Evaluating Your Digital Maturity. In today's webinar, we are going to explore the topic of digital maturity and specifically discuss how to assess where you currently stand, how to get started, and touch up a little bit upon implementing programs that will help advance maturity. But first, let me introduce our speakers for today. Brent is our Senior Director of Business Strategy and Transformation here at SumTotal. With over 20 years of experience in the fields of learning and talent, he has successfully initiated and optimized online learning platforms and programs throughout his HR career. His expertise was recognized in 2005 by WebEx as their Innovator of the Year, and in 2007 by Skillsoft, SumTotal's parent company, awarded him Learning Leader of the Year. And joining him today is Trish McFarlane, the CEO and Principal Analyst at H3 HR Advisors. With over 20 years of experience, Trish has filled roles such as HR Executive, VP of Global HCM Product Management, and HR Analyst and Influencer. Her industry experience in Big Four public accounting, PR, healthcare, manufacturing, and IT all play into her strengths of strategically advising her clients. Additionally, Trish is the author of the HR Ringleader blog and co-host of the popular HR Happy Hour podcast, and in 2020 was the host of the Work Break blog. So we're in great hands today with both Brent and Trish. So without further ado, Trish, take it away.
Thank you so much. I am really excited to be here today with Brent. It's wonderful to see you. I know we've been anxiously awaiting speaking about this important topic. And today we're really going to try and have a very casual conversation so that anyone in the audience, any of the attendees, will walk away with some understanding of digital maturity, how to assess where they are and their organization is on the spectrum of digital maturity, and really give you some ideas to think about whether you're thinking about fourth quarter changes or maybe even as you enter into the new year. So thank you, Brent, for having me. I'm excited to see you.
It's a pleasure to be here and really looking forward to the conversation, Trish.
Good. Well, you know, while we've done a lot of preparation for this, and you and I have kind of tossed around a lot of different ideas, but why don't we start out by just level setting for all of the attendees and thinking about from the perspective of you and just SumTotal, how do you view organizational digital maturity, and why is that important to organizations right now more than ever?
Sure. Well, what we've done is we've actually looked at a model that we've taken. It's a 5-stage model. Starts at siloed, kind of at the very beginning, stage 1, all the way up to optimized at the very end of that. And in between various touch points that will log and track the maturity of an organization. But what we've done is we've looked at 9 different areas that are critical to how an organization operates their learning and talent processes in general, their HR processes. And we've mapped them to those 5 stages. And so for us, we've given a model that has this matrix of understanding how an organization can currently assess itself in terms of where they are, but then we also provide that opportunity to show them where the next steps are based on the information that we have in the model. It's based on crowdsourced expertise from customers, subject matter experts, myself and others. So we really help provide a roadmap towards digital maturity. But really the bottom line of why anyone should be concerned about digital maturity is ultimately it allows for more of an efficiency to operate in this crazy world that we're in right now. I think people need to be able to react and respond and adapt quickly. And when you have an organization that is more digitally mature, we've seen data that says that those organizations that are more digitally mature are twice as able to adapt rapidly versus competitors that potentially aren't as digitally mature.
Great, thank you. You know, as you were giving that description, I was thinking, from what you've done in your research, have you found that it makes a difference the size of your organization, for example, and that sort of success to adapting quickly, or is it more important about how digitally mature you are?
Size is interesting because it just depends on the layers or levels of decision making that happens. And typically what we find in a lot of the learning programs is there's a core group of individuals, whether it's a director in a team in that learning space or a VP in a team. But they are usually the ones that can drive the change. And so what we like to do is we like to work with those teams first to ensure that they are aligned in what they are understanding as far as the reality of the organization. Part of it, I apologize, my dog, it's a kind of fine edged sword. If he's outside, he wants to come in. If he's inside, he may see the UPS guy. So I apologize for any background noise. Um, but in regard to the size, I mean, it's all about who's driving it, who are the decision makers. And a lot of what is the reality of this is you need to make sure that they're aligned in what the direction of that you want to go, but also what the current state is. If you understand what your current state of the organization is from a maturity perspective, it's easier then to move everyone forward. The problem that we've found is that there's a misalignment. Could be based on tenure with the organization, could be based on the role in the organization that has visibility or lack of visibility in certain areas. So it's a mixed bag in terms of where people see things. I always say it's what lens are they viewing the organization through. And really what we want to do with the process of aligning them is getting everyone on that same page. So everyone's seeing where they currently are as an organization in a realistic sense, not in a desired sense, but what the reality is so that they can then take those steps to move forward to become more digitally mature and more efficiently as well.
I'm glad you mentioned that. I was going to ask you that in terms of, do people assess where they are on their own in a realistic way? So it sounds like there is potentially a disconnect, and because people are having those different lenses. So how does that work when you first, go in and you're working with the organization? Are you working across maybe some of those silos to help people assess and get on the same page? What does that beginning of the process look like for them?
So the beginning of the process is I kind of lean on my project management background in some sense is having that stakeholder analysis. You really have to find out who is a detractor or a supporter of any of these initiatives that you're trying to work. And generally what we want to do is we want to involve those that can have some sort of positive or negative influence because it's important to have their buy-in. You may be trying to change perception from a detractor. You may be trying to encourage and enthusiate or make it more enthusiastic a supporter. So it's a matter of choosing that stakeholder analysis to bring in that group. Then when you involve them in the process, the first thing we want them to do is essentially assess where they currently believe the organization to be. And we have our diagnostic tool that allows individuals to see these 9 areas that we've identified, and they basically rate them where they are on each of those on the scale. What we find is that it's always interesting. There's no 2 answers are alike, but in the process, they start to question or they start to see things. And then as we move forward, where we bring the groups together, it allows us to have a dialogue that's constrained within the parameters of the model, but it allows for more effective and driven discussion versus trying to just move across all sorts of areas. So it allows us with those 9 areas and those 5 stages to have a very structured conversation to achieve a very realistic setting in terms of what the reality in that organization for their maturity is.
I love that. And I know we're going to dig in a minute on what some of those 9 um, different indicators are. But before that, you mentioned detractors, and I'm thinking back to my HR career. I know you've probably encountered many in your career, and anyone listening, I'm sure, can identify some in their head of detractors from time to time. But I will agree. I think there's sometimes a benefit to getting a detractor or 2 on board early, so that really becomes their project, and they have some skin in the game initially. What if you're an HR leader or a business person right now listening to this, and you're thinking, some of my detractors might be in that C-suite, but we really need to understand our digital maturity. What would you tell them, maybe to help them convince these leaders who could be those barriers and get them on board a little quicker?
Well, I'll tell you, there's nothing more powerful than a detractor that you can flip. I know that's
Right?
from my experience. Um, and what's interesting is if you can demonstrate to them that there is an opportunity to improve or to create more opportunity, typically they start to think a little differently. It is a challenge because more than likely the detractors are protectionists for the organization. They're wanting to make sure that they are protecting the status quo, maintaining that status quo. But if you can start to demonstrate that the status quo is no longer safe and that you can methodically move towards a much better opportunity, that's one way of doing it. A lot of them are also ingrained in processes. There may be processes, and processes are one of those areas that I really think organizations have to look at. They've needed to look at for years past, but it's more important than ever to reevaluate processes today because so many things have changed. And the idea of a five-step process from 1 to 5 having to be done in the same way that it was done 2 years ago, steps 2 and 3 may be irrelevant today, or they may cause a delay in something. And so you have to look at that detractor and provide them a viable alternative that could be better than the current state, that has a base of rationale and saying things have changed. And yes, we did do it this way, but the reality is that we can't support this in this manner, or the market doesn't support this in this manner, or employees are really moving beyond this current state of where things are in stages 2 and 3 as far as that five-step process.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. Being able to sort of get them on board and have them understand what those opportunities are for them. I think too, sometimes people are detractors because maybe they've not been included in the past, or maybe it's been a long time since they really were heard. So even flipping that detractor can be accomplished just by inclusion, which again, we'll dig into that a little bit as we go along. Maybe before we start digging in, could you talk about the 9 indicators, kind of high level, so that people understand? I know we're even seeing some questions coming in about, we will also have documents and follow-up for anyone
Yeah.
after this, what those are. But if you could maybe run through the 9, and then we can kind of answer some questions around those and how they work.
Sure. I'll try and do my best from memory, but I'll also have to maybe use a little cheat sheet because there are
That's
9.
totally fine.
But yes, what we've done is we've identified 9 areas in an organization that are critical to the ability to innovate, to drive change in the organization from an HR learning and development and talent perspective. And so the first one is we call people-centric culture. And I would say this is probably one of the most important because if you have a culture that is supportive of change and supportive of the digital innovation that you want to do, you're going to find things a lot easier to move forward with. A culture that is very closed or maybe resistant to change is going to be a challenge. And so we actually purposely put people-centric because that allows an organization to look towards the benefits of their employees, how they're going to support them. We next look at what HR's role and strategy is. So, I've been in many corporations, and it depends on the structure. Is it a centralized HR department? Is it a decentralized? Do you have a CHRO and then divisional VPs across the country? It all lends to consistency in how the learning function is supported within those HR departments. Again, centralized versus decentralized creates different dynamics in terms of data, budgets, how they're perceived and rolled out throughout the organization. Governance is one of the areas that has really picked up, and it's probably, again, I'll say this is my favorite indicator because it can affect the other 8. Governance is all about putting parameters around your organization. It's a matter of consistency. It's a matter of saying, all right, we're going to align our budget spend. We're going to align our catalog so that we understand what's in, that there's no redundancy. We want to make sure from our administration that we have consistent controls so that we don't have someone accidentally assigning forces to a group of people because they've got so much authority. We want to contain that. When you have distributed HR or distributed departments, you can use that governance to align so that you have proper administration rights within an area. It could be isolated to that physical location, could be isolated to a division. But governance plays a role in cost efficiencies, operational efficiencies that really cascade across the rest of the spectrum. Employee experience is one of our indicators, and this is really more important today than ever before, because being in HR for many, many years, I've been in the role where we were buying technology because of the back end, and we weren't really paying attention to what, or cared much about what the employee had to deal with, just because they just had to deal with it. That's no longer the role anymore. Employees now have much more power in dictating what they will or won't use. And the reality is if the employee doesn't want to use a particular tool, they're not going to be putting data into the system, which ultimately makes those reports that you so desired moot. So we want to make sure employee experience is part of this process. Our technology infrastructure, on-premise, SaaS, mobile capabilities, those play into it. That's one of our key indicators. Funding plays a big role. A lot of times is it you're the first cut in the downturn, or are you a protected budget? Do you get budget dollars from other departments? Do they pay in if you do training for them? Would they pay into that across budget lines, departmental lines? So funding is an area that is dependent upon it. There's a lot of average amounts that are also played out. You could look at what the average spend is by an industry, by a profession, depending upon safety requirements. That could be more than others. Professionally, I think it's roughly around $1,800 to $2,200 per person per year is what some budget standards are. Organizational alignment and curation strategy. This is a very long title for ultimately what we want to say is, how is content brought into the organization? What is your curation strategy? When we think about where things have gone from a pre-purchased library of content from companies such as Skillsoft to crowdsourcing material, when we look at the invasion of TikTok in our lives, or some of these spun up quick short video clips of things, crowdsource curation is something that we're finding more and more important. As employees experience opportunities in the organization, they want to share best practices. And with the early, the generations coming in now, they're very comfortable in videoing things and sharing them. And so with platforms that we have out there, you can curate this from a crowdsourced video brought in to ensure that it may be appropriate and supportive of the organization, and you can push that out through the platform. So it's very important to see where your content's coming from. Again, efficiencies, don't have redundant content, don't have out-of-date content, and ensure that your content is aligned with the purposes of your organization. Elective participation, this is an indicator that we look to. It's that push versus pull. Do your employees go to the platform, or do they seek it out? That would be them pulling on it. Or do you have to tell people twice a year they have to go in and just take content for compliance? So elective participation, the more it's actually tied to our employee experience. If it's a very pleasing employee experience, more than likely people will gravitate to it to find content to take. And then the last indicator I'll mention is reporting and measurement. And this is really important. It's what gets measured gets done. We all know that. SMART goals are the best goals because they have a measure within them. Well, from a reporting and measurement standpoint, when it comes to learning and talent programs, I've always said that the more you can align with what the business is interested in affecting, so whether it's safety is a big criteria for the business, or efficiency or turnover, find a metric that the CEO and the CFO care about and align your learning and talent processes to that. That will be more effective to get you more goodwill up front, so that you can start to measure on other initiatives that you want to within your learning program later. But you have to display that relevance to the organization of how you can affect things at the business level, at the organizational level that they care about. So that's a quick rundown of our 9 areas.
You know what, and it's interesting because each one is valuable in such a different way. And we're going to try and get to as many as we can in our time we have left. But I think overarching, what strikes me as you were talking is, all of this is about having learning as a priority in your organization. And I know there are bound to be attendees who are thinking, well, that's maybe not a priority right now in my organization. Maybe it is because of the pandemic, or maybe it wasn't prior to the pandemic, right? There are other things they have going on. So what would you say to organizational leaders who are listening who might not have learning as a priority, or even if they think it's a priority, how can they make that more of a priority for their organization? What's kind of the business case behind that?
Well, I'd say the number one business case right now is attracting and retaining talent. We're walking through one of the most interesting periods of time right now, whether it's called the Big Quit or the Great Resignation. You're seeing people walk away from organizations if they don't find that there's opportunities for them. And one of the biggest reasons they're promoting is development. And I think it's because we've moved to more of a skill-based economy these days that we're seeing skills, whether it's upskilling and reskilling, we hear those terms all the time, but it's this intent to look at skills which are constantly in a flux. They're being replaced almost daily, monthly, weekly. Elon Musk even just recently talked about skills are more important than degrees. And so people are looking towards development opportunities. So executives need to understand that there is a greater emphasis on development by the employee as far as a level of one of their hierarchies that they need to have at the top. The other part is that development's not just the one part of it. It's they need to see that there's an opportunity for them to grow in the organization. So development tied to career pathing, showing me where I can move in the organization. If an employee sees that, they're going to be attracted to that organization. They're going to want to stay. If they don't feel like they're getting that, they're going to find another organization that will do that. And the biggest change I think that's happened in the last 2 years with everything happening is that previously we saw executives were saying, we're a learning organization. The employees would hear that. Middle management would say, it's on your own time. We have KPIs to hit. There has been a 180 by the mid-management. They understand the value of development. And so what might have initially been said, do that on your own time, is now being accommodated and being supported during the day. And I think a larger portion of that is the remoteness, is that there's less of their ability to police it versus being in a shared location. And so they realize that the benefit of having that employee in this very tight talent market is greater than ever before. And so they're going to support those development opportunities.
Yeah, great examples. I will say too, I think that when you mentioned Elon Musk, being able to go to your executive team, your executive colleagues, and give them some of those examples they're not maybe familiar with is a good step, I think. So, and it seems like they're more and more readily available right now. It is in the news constantly. I know I just read a report a week or two ago. I believe it was maybe Deloitte and Fortune magazine, but they were talking about that. They're interviewing thousands of CEOs who are saying that skill development, retention, those are now bubbling up to be the most important priority. So it does feel like maybe in the past where HR leaders might have had a little harder time convincing someone else in the C-suite that it was a priority, hopefully sort of this influx of what's happening in the news and being reported in surveys and so forth will kind of back that up, I think.
Well, and you're absolutely right. I mean, I've been having conversations with CHROs the last couple of years in which what they're finding is and I call it the talent pipelines, the shift in the talent pipelines is that the traditional model of college students moving into professional roles, there's been a disconnect in the skill sets. And I think part of it is I've been challenging this model for a while, but when you think about 4 years for a college degree versus a business cycles tend to operate between 6 to 12 months. So when you think about the scale and the speed at which businesses are operating, and then the college students are coming out after 4 years, there's a challenge that CHROs are telling me that the employees, these graduates are not coming in with the skills that they have. So they're having to reinvest in the development of them. Things like conflict management or running a team meeting or just interpersonal skills. A lot of these are the secondary effect of pushing a STEM technology approach for so many years that they realized they had these very technically savvy people that had no interpersonal skills. And so now there's been a flip to saying we need more interpersonal soft skills in the workforce, and we can teach the technical skills, the STEM skills as a secondary. So there's been so many interesting shifts just in the last couple of years in regard to development, skills, talent, how it runs through the organization, that I think this is also contributing to more of that need, more of that emphasis and demand on development opportunities, learning functions within an organization.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. I'm nodding my head because I'm thinking for myself. I have twins who are seniors, just got accepted and are going to go to University of Nebraska. One of the main things that we found in the whole entire college review process was there are certain universities who are still very traditional in their approach to education, but one of the main factors my students used was that that particular university, University of Nebraska, was really weighing your education and your internship opportunities from day one. And they really sold that on, we're changing the way we do education so that when your student graduates, he or she has had all of these experiences so that, to your point, it gets them ready for that workplace.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, we have a whole generation of people who haven't made that flip, right? So now HR is having to kind of deal with that, right?
Yeah, I mean, I've always said business will always find a way. And,
Yeah,
I think what we're seeing is partnering of businesses with schools in the similar, mention what you just said,
sure.
to start to steer those curriculums towards the idea of these are the skills I need. This is also playing out with the airline industry. They're buying flight schools because there's such a shortage of actual pilots, because it takes so much in the expense to train up pilots. So you're seeing airlines buying flight schools. I will also say, you offered up your kids as far as an example. I have a son who's a freshman in college right now, and the summer before his school year started, he was able to get a job with an HR organization, and they were teaching him skills in Microsoft Teams and Excel and having meetings and such. And they've actually asked him if he would stay on through his college year now. And what I
Oh,
see is that this organization is being smart. They're grooming the student, my son, in terms of these
right.
skills. So he's going to get his degree, but he's also learning business operational
Yeah,
skills at the same time. So, I mean, whether or not he ends up working for this company after he graduates is anyone's guess. But the reality is that they're making an investment, and maybe 2 out of the 5 that they have doing the same type of role will actually become those employees. That's a lot better than not having someone ready to go for them day one.
sure. Oh, that's a great example. So, and I'm sure that the listeners probably are seeing similar, right? They're probably aware of companies who may be doing some of the same type strategies to think longer term about recruiting versus just trying to fill a role right now today. So can you talk a little bit about, we're talking kind of big picture and how, education and learning ultimately have to tie together. But I know I hear from a lot of HR professionals, I'm maybe in a smaller organization or I have a smaller budget, right? So I'm someone who tends to purchase maybe more of a Band-Aid sort of a fix when something goes wrong, right?
Mhm.
What if I'm an HR professional in that sort of a situation, but I'm hearing you and I'm hearing and buying into this idea of becoming a digitally mature organization? What can what can they maybe do? Some baby steps to get them going in their organization and make an impact.
Well, what's great about everything is that we've seen such an acceleration in innovation over the last couple of years. I would say that what has been characteristic of our industry for probably the last decade was this idea of pilots or case studies for trying to do these small innovative things. The coupling that with the progression of technology, the cloud-based ability to apply platforms fairly quickly, as well as licensing changes so that you don't have to be a giant enterprise. You can find a small business solution, mid-sized business solution that is actually fully supported in the cloud that will work with your organization. So there's lots of opportunities, but what we're finding is that the idea of these patchwork systems in the past, whether it was you were heavily invested in Microsoft Office as your core HR function, or you
Right.
had one system embedded into others, a lot of that worked when you had people co-located. But what's happened now is because we're all, from a professional perspective, so distributed, there has to be this need for access to centralized data at any time from anywhere to leverage it to be used in other purposes. And so I think what we're finding is that organizations are no longer worried about the case study or the isolated group. They're applying it across the board and saying, look, we're going to try this. We have to do this. We have to do this in order to survive. And it's more of necessity, which drives a lot more and actually strips out a lot of the politics. I mean, the term that I've loved hearing is that this is the end of digital resistance. When
Ooh, I
you
like
think
that.
about digital transformation was in many instances I was involved in death marches. It was this long drawn out process because you had to deal with all the politics and challenges around why we should do things differently. Well,
Right.
when we've seen the model change so rapidly over the last 18 months, and like I said, it's no longer a case study or a pilot. This is now the end of digital resistance, and this adoption has to happen because there is no other alternative. And the politics that were there in the past are probably very different now or even moot at the point where we're moving forward. So to me, it's one of those things. It's self-preservation, and self-preservation drives a lot more, uh, you know, benefits in terms of process efficiencies than anything else.
Yeah, I agree. I hadn't really heard it put quite that way about the end of digital resistance, but that's true. I mean, there are a lot of horrible things about, being in the pandemic, but I do think you're right. I think it's going to help whether you're an HR leader, another type of talent leader, maybe just someone who has a big stake in the people development in your organization. But yeah, it's kind of bringing it to the forefront. Like you can't ignore it, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm making notes like crazy because I feel like I learned from these just as much as any of our attendees. So, and I loved what you said about the distributed workforce, right? It's really going to force that issue. So really now is the time, right? Even if you've not had that opportunity to talk with your C-suite about this, or if you're in the C-suite, maybe your colleagues about this, but it really feels like the time is right. If I'm in that mode, right, and now I'm familiar with the 9 indicators, and I'm someone who's really buying into this. I really want to help kind of move the needle in my organization. Is there one of the, I know you said you had a favorite indicator under
Right.
governance, but would you also say that's the strongest positive influencer? Uh, or is there another indicator that, if I'm the listener, should I really be kind of really just honed in on as I think through this?
Well, yeah, so it's a great point. And yes, I did kind of indicate or tip my hand that I had a favorite, but I will say when we work with customers and as I work in workshops with some of our customers, there
Yeah,
are 9 indicators and all of them are important to the success and the movement of digital maturity. But there's 2 I would say are probably have the most secondary impact. And one of them is governance, but the other is culture. And the 2 have to really, if you have a people-centric culture that is, very much supportive of the change, and then you can align it with a governance program that provides that kind of strategy and alignment of what you're trying to do. Those 2 can actually be very powerful. And we honestly say, we don't want anyone to really choose more than 2 indicators to work on because you can't push all 9 down the road. You've got to push 1 or 2, focus your efforts. The reality is that by choosing 1 or 2 of those, the rest will eventually follow. You'll be able to have secondary impacts on them. But yeah, to your point in question, I would say the culture is, I almost say some of these 9 indicators are big rocks and little rocks.
right.
it's a big rock, culture. You're not going to change culture in 6 months or even a year. It's going to take a while. It's kind of like that cruise ship turning on a dime versus a speedboat. But I will say that if you have a solid culture, that's the bedrock that will support the changes that you need to have. Governance is merely an effective way of pushing and changing a lot of those other indicators.
Do you see clients that you work with where you come in and you do this assessment, a workshop, you work with them with the tools you have, maybe they are strong on culture or governance. Is it different for each organization then, I guess, where they are on that path? So my organization might be focused on two completely different things. If my culture is solid, is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, I mean, each organization has different challenges, and what's interesting is when I go into the process of working with them, we ask them to first, through our diagnostic tool, we ask the team, that group of stakeholders, if you will, that we've talked about, to self-assess first. And then what I do is I consolidate those results. And then the key part of all of this is asking them to come together, and we'll take this diagnostic one more time, but they all have to agree on where they are on each one of those indicators. They cannot choose two answers. They have to choose one. And what we find is
Oh,
that
okay.
the consolidated average of the individuals is always higher than the reality on the scale of what the group consensus ends up being when there's a discussion. And then it depends on the organization. If they want to find a way to strike quickly and have some wins, they may look at doing things with changing the employee experience. If they can change the layout of a home page, it might provide greater access to content. Or they may want to jump onto the governance. I use those two examples because governance and employee experience tend to be what the companies gravitate to. I think culture, they agree and understand that if they're having this conversation, they're supportive of it,
Right.
but they may use this also to find ways to bring in other supporters, other budgetary areas that could help them out, support those functions. So it's different each time, but what's interesting is that the dialogue that happens when we do this kind of consolidated group to take the diagnostic, that's actually the most beneficial knowledge and information outside of the tool itself. I mean, anything that I'm bringing to the game pales in comparison to the ability for an organization to have people sharing the viewpoints of the reality of their organization. And that information, I always say, is golden because we're merely surfacing it. Like we said, we're providing the 5 stages and the 9 indicators to give them that playing field to work within. But when they share the information along those lines, as it relates to their organization, not hypothetical or extended kind of
Right.
sample, they're giving this information, and it really is powerful as they now become aligned to be able to then say, here's where we are, and now what we're going to talk about is how we can move forward to become more digitally mature. And that alignment, that assessment, then aligning, and then executing, that executing becomes much more effective when everybody's executing from the same standpoint.
Sure, of course. I know we're going to leave some time for questions, but before we do that, the last thing I really wanted to hit on is a little more, I don't know, raw for some of the listeners, I'm sure, is, these are hard times, right? We still have some businesses that are actually just struggling to stay afloat, right? But they also, in addition to doing that, they want to be thinking about what can they be doing to still plan ahead.
Mhm.
For anyone who might be in that situation, what is your advice for those businesses, right? Because to me, I'm thinking it's still very important to think about my digital maturity and where things are now as I'm trying to keep my business going and in fact get back on successful terms. What are your best pointers for those situations?
Well, I think it's a matter of just getting a foothold and trying to find where you can make that change. It's not about necessarily investing and putting in a full-blown system. It's about doing first the assessment. I would say, if anything, one of the best exercises, of course, at the time I was going through it, I didn't really appreciate it for the value of it, but I was in an organization where we actually mapped out all of the processes in our organization, in our service organization. And every department was given, we went through about 2 weeks of training on process mapping. That was how much investment this was at the time, so that we could go back and anything and everything we did in our organization, in our department, in our team, had to be mapped out from a process map flow so that we understood what we were doing. That gave us visibility to see where we were effectively doing things inefficiently or effectively, or what, every step had to have a rationale attached to it. Now, I'm not saying an organization that's struggling needs to do this to the extent that I just described, but what I am saying is start to look around and understanding how you do things today. The more you can be aware of how you go about, whether it's a process, a step, a service, delivery, what you're manufacturing, I look at it from a broader perspective and say, could this be done more efficiently? Could we apply technology to do this? Could we apply a different way of doing this? Ultimately, you have to find ways to become more efficient, whether it's through technology or just through the process that you're doing things. We unfortunately don't have the time, and that's probably one of the greatest commodities of all these days, is time. That in past, we had lots of time. We could stretch things out. That's why we spent a decade just trying case studies and pilots, because it really didn't matter much. But what we're seeing is that time has compressed so much now that we have to be able to respond quickly. And that's ultimately the reality of a business, is to be able to respond quickly, whether it's to competitors or to changing forces in the market. And when we look at the current situation right now with the backlog in shipping and on the East Coast and on the West Coast, I mean, we're looking at things that are going to be changing again that we've never seen before. And again, how are we going to respond? We have to respond rapidly and in a way that supports the initiatives of the organization. So ultimately, anything that you can do to start identifying ways to be more efficient, cut out the excess, will eventually help you in the transition when you can afford it to a technology, because then you'll be able to say, all right, we were able to do it this fast now without the technology. We can actually cut out a couple of steps and do it even faster.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you for those insights, because I also think those companies that might be struggling, there's no better time to try some of these new ways of thinking, right? That is the time to re-examine it, because maybe the decisions you made are what got you to that point. Shake it up now, right?
Yeah.
And I think too, even reaching out to you, having those discussions, right? They may not be as far down the path as they're thinking they need to be to start that, but get those insights from you now, so that that will help in their planning longer term, because hopefully they'll be able to get things back on track. And even when I go back all the way to the beginning of our discussion, where you're talking about you know um, the the struggles that people are having with retention and with hiring, right? A lot of that plays into ultimately maybe why organizations are failing currently, because they weren't managing that appropriately. So yeah, I think if we go back, I know we're going to give obviously lots of ways for them to connect with you all after the conversation today, but maybe before that, let's open it up. I know we've had a couple questions coming in. It looks like some of them have been answered already, but let's just give it a few minutes. If you're listening in, if you have some questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A, and we will start answering them to the best of our ability. And if we don't get to any, we will follow up after the webinar.
Sure. Definitely.
Okay. So it looks like the first one that came in is, which criteria would you suggest to an organization to use in its selection of various digital solutions to propel its operations?
What
Great question.
criteria? Interesting. So, I mean, ultimately, you want to look at what is the goal of what you're going to apply that technology to do, and then you want it to be able to be effective. It's a challenge to say. I think the impact of our consumer tendencies is really the biggest challenge to having technology in our organizations today, because organizations are complex. Consumer technology isn't necessarily as complex as some of our needs. But I would say aligning what you can get out of that technology, that purchase, and being realistic. Be very upfront with what are your goals. articulate those goals very specifically. If you cannot meet the goals with what that is, then you need to continue to keep looking. But I think you need to be very specific about what you're wanting to achieve, and then having very much demonstrable connections to those to say this could happen and then we can achieve this very rapidly.
Yeah. You know what, I would add too that, just from working in HR for so many years, 2 decades before I started doing what I'm doing now, it always came down to, for me, trying not to get too caught up in sort of a recency effect of what the problems of the business were. Because often if you're only solving for like what's right, that fire right in front of you, you're not thinking ahead. So if whether it's you with your HR team, you with maybe a team across some of the different departments, divisions, whatever, however your organization is set up, try and have some of those conversations where you pull different people together and almost put up your dream list of like, okay, what do we really want to solve for in the next year? What about 2 years out? What if we could have it all, right? Have a little bit of a path that way too, so that yes, you are trying to get technology solutions to digital solutions for now, but also for down the road.
Yep.
Gives you a little bit longer runway, I think, if you do it that way.
Exactly.
Yeah. Let's see. Any other questions coming in? I know everyone is probably shy, but we have to get back into the swing of things here. We'll see. We'll give it a minute or two and see if anything else comes in.
Yep. Trish, I have a few questions that came in a little bit earlier when you guys were speaking,
Oh, sure.
which I can hand over to you guys.
Please do.
Perfect. So one of the questions that came up was, is there a difference between digital maturity and digital transformation?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a difference between digital maturity and digital transformation. The digital maturity is essentially the goal that you want to have. The transformation is your ability to actually execute on that. We've seen, though, with digital transformation, it can take forever. And I think really when you look at what you're trying to do from a digital maturity perspective, you need to stop saying we're going through a digital transformation. That's drawn out. Digital maturity is what do we want to do, where do we want to be, and we're just going to essentially drive to that now. The transformation, that unfortunately was a term that has been negative connotations probably for the last decade because people were trying to do these official digital transformation journeys. And again, as like I said, the last decade was pilots and case studies. We're past that. We're now into the application and really the need to go into being more of a digitally mature organization. All right, I'll let you, Trish, if you want to respond to that too.
I think you nailed it from my perspective as well. I would just say, to me, that digital maturity is much more of a surgical type term, right? To your point, it gets you right in where you need to be. It's not talking about some, drawn out journey, as you mentioned. So yeah, I agree with that.
Perfect. And as you were talking throughout the past half an hour or so, you keep mentioning a diagnostic. So for the group, is this a diagnostic that is currently available? And if so, where they can find it? And
Sure.
then sort of following up on that is, does this help evaluate their current state over time or give them a little bit of a roadmap to move forward?
Oh, that's great. So yes, we have a tool. It's a diagnostic tool. It's available at omi.sumtotalsystems.com. And essentially it's free. First of all, it's free. You'll put in some basic demographic information so that we can benchmark later against that type of information from your organization and the industry, which we look to in terms of understanding where organizations stand from their maturity. You'll be asked 9 questions in which there's actually 6 answers. These are characterizations of where you would be in your organization. And this is the same process we've talked about that I use with companies. At the end, you'll actually be given an output. And what we do is we tell you where you currently stand from the 1 to 5 scale in regards to maturity of those 9 indicators we've discussed. And then we also give you an output. We give you 1 page per indicator, and we tell you what the next stage forward would look like for that indicator. So we're actually helping you assess where your current state is, and then we're giving you the insight to where you can move forward on that indicator. Now, we're giving you all 9 indicators what the next step forward looks like, but as I mentioned with Tricia, the intent is to look for 1 or 2 that you want to drive forward.
Fantastic. And when organizations are evaluating the maturity, is there a frequency that's recommended?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the indicator, and like I said, the 9 indicators, there's big rocks and little rocks. How you want to move those forward is going to depend on the scale of that indicator that you're going after. We've had some customers that have essentially charted and said, we're going to move up 1 level each year for the next 3 years. So they're putting essentially a 12-month time parameter around their attempt to move forward 1 level on that indicator that they chose. So you can strategically do that. I would say any type of approach to doing that, you want to make sure you're putting a plan around it, that you're checking back against it. That's what we give you in the output, is we tell you what the next level would look like. And if those are goals that you want to move towards, there is no definitive timeline. How aggressive you want to get in moving forward is entirely up to you and your organization. But we do provide you that opportunity to say, this is what it would look like if you were to be further along on the maturity scale in these indicators.
Right. We did have another one come in that's really interesting, Brent. This one's from Michelle Moreno. So thank you, Michelle. With the view that change is easiest at the margin, onboarding may be the easiest point to make change so that new employees are the most digitally aware. Can this path be one to bring forward the core, almost like an annual refresher, like what you would do with like a benefits renewal process? Have you seen any companies or any of your clients doing it that way?
The onboarding is a great place, and this is where I like to kind of say that the more uniformity you can have in your experience with the employee, and consistency will start with the onboarding. So if they see that the employee experience in the onboarding is positive and they get used to it, and if they can see that the data that they're putting into the system is essentially priming that pump down the road, the more they use it, the more beneficial it becomes, both to the organization from the data that's captured, but it also, in these days, much like our consumer, has probably AI that will start to direct and create opportunities, provide information, recommendations, and such. And so absolutely, from the onboarding, carries it through. What's frustrating in the years past that I've done is I can recall spending an inordinate amount of time applying for a job in a Taleo system, spending hours entering that. Trish, you know what I'm talking about. You spent hours
I know,
entering
I'm doing the same thing.
into this Taleo system. You get hired and they hand you a stack of papers and say, I need you to fill out all this information because the Taleo system didn't talk to the PeopleSoft system. And so they had to rekey it. And from an onboarding perspective, you got to question what is going on, because if I spent all this time and it didn't mean anything, that's the questionnaire is actually correct. If there's a seamless transition from onboarding to the system and use, and you see the benefit of that, that is the greatest connection, will then demonstrate and engender an employee experience as well as much more higher elective participation.
Yeah, I liked your suggestion. You're right. I'm sitting there thinking like, oh my gosh, so much rekeying back in the day, right?
Yeah.
So, hey, listen, I know we're getting down to the last couple of minutes. I want to make sure we have time to put the slide up, our last slide, so you can maybe just do a quick overview of SumTotal for everyone. I know that will also, you can answer the question. We have someone who's missed the 9 indicators. I don't want to misspeak, but I do believe we're making that available after the fact as well. So I will turn it over to you and maybe give a quick rundown for everyone where they can get more information about this.
Perfect. And this is where I can quick jump in. What we wanted to just quick give a little bit of a overview of who we are as a company, SumTotal, as well as we'll answer a few of your questions and we'll have some follow-up materials a little bit later on. But First, SumTotal. Here at SumTotal, we believe in making the complex simple and creating an opportunity for everyone to grow and advance in an ever-changing world. We specialize in the development and growth of individuals to support the adaptability, agility, and resilience of your people and organization. To this end, we believe that the only way to build a future-fit organization is to nurture a learning culture and give your leaders and learners the tools they need to grow. SumTotal delivers these tools for even the most complex, highly regulated environments. So with a robust core platform, we're here as a partner. And to learn more, you can visit SumTotalSystems.com. And a lot of what we do is really being there as that business partner. And this is related to that diagnostic, what we've talked about. We want to make sure that it's understanding what are your needs. And as Brent has been talking about today, you really need to figure out where are you at currently in order to figure out what's those next steps. And the diagnostic tool in particular can be found at omi.sumtotalsystems.com. And that will follow up with a specific recommendation. First of all, identifying where you are based on your answers and the 9 indicators that Brent has gone over a little bit earlier today, as well as just sort of some recommendations of what's going forward. But want to thank you all for attending our fireside chat, and in particular, thank you both Trish and Brent for your expertise. And I know I really enjoyed hearing how you dove into digital maturity and how there, in particular, you can use these 9 indicators to help get an idea of where are some of those areas that you are currently successful and where you can continue to grow. So thank you all very much and have a great rest of your day.